Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We're going to get started in a few minutes. Just give some last people some time to trickle in. As you'll see in the chat, I did add a note. Due to the nature of the presentation, we prefer if you did not, start any third-party transcript or recording tools. Mostly that's AI tools in this day and age. So if you do start them, I will be kicking them from the meeting. So just to save both of us time, we'd appreciate it if you did not start them. But as I said, we'll get started in a few minutes here, and thank you again, everybody, for attending.
I'll give 1 minute before you can. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Chantel Bush. I am the Health at Home Branch Chief. We will be starting our presentation on the invoice reimbursement request process. Just wanted to remind you all about putting questions in the chat box. We are also asking that you continue to stay muted during the webinar, and you may use the chat box to enter any feedback that you have. We will provide an opportunity for questions and answers, and we will also be managing the chat box, and we'll be addressing any questions that we are able to address via the chat. A copy of this presentation will be available and posted on our CDA website under the Bridge to Recovery Grant webpage. Again, I wanted to go over the agenda for today. So next slide, please. So on today's agenda, our intent is to collaborate this presentation with our CDA team, as well as our Contract Grant Administrator Public Consulting Group, better known as PCG. We intend to go over a few components, which does include how do we get reimbursed, and we will go over the reimbursement request overview and timeline. We will also provide an opportunity to provide some actual examples, and we will also address common errors. We also will go over the change request form and the budget shift request process. In addition, we will open it up for questions and answers. And lastly, we will also provide a resource page dedicated to content that you can refer to or other options to get your questions and concerns addressed. Next slide, please. Today's goal of our webinar is to ensure that the grantees leave here with an opportunity to have a better understanding, to learn how to submit a complete invoice reimbursement request form. We also want to provide examples of what supporting documentation that is required in order for your reimbursement request to be reviewed and approved for any eligible expenses that were approved in your budget. We also want you to walk away with an understanding of what you can do if a change is needed. In addition, we will go over how to submit a change request form, and we will discuss how to request a budget shift from an approved budget category to another approved budget category that is outlined in your executed grant agreement. And lastly, we will ensure that you have available the resources on where to go to if you need assistance or help. I will turn over the next portion of our presentation to Roxanne McAlpine, who is our Bridge to Recovery Grant Project Manager for CDA.
Good morning, and thank you, Chantel. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, Chantel mentioned the goals of this webinar, and I will be going over the invoice reimbursement request overview and timeline. Next slide, please. So this is a reimbursement grant program, and what does that mean? A reimbursement grant program is where grantees are responsible for paying all costs up front using their own resources and funds. Then we will reimburse you as you submit your receipts. So any items that were approved in your executed grant agreement, including bonuses, salaries, Any contractual work you were going to do, installing HVACs, you must pay for those items up front, and then you'll submit an invoice request along with supporting documentation showing proof that you've paid for those items, and then you will get reimbursed. And we recognize that a reimbursement grant program can be a hardship for some of you. So the purpose of this webinar is to try to assist you and help you understand that you must submit proper documentation showing that you have purchased those items first before you can get reimbursed. And we're trying to get you guys reimbursed in a timely manner. And again, this webinar is to teach you how you can submit proper documentation so you can get reimbursed on a faster basis. So this is not a grant where we give you the funds up front and then you purchase or begin the work. We have received many bids and invoices requesting funds, but the work has not been done. So we just want to make sure that everybody understands that this is a reimbursement grant and you must purchase your items or the work must be complete, and then you submit that documentation for reimbursement. This is not an unconditional grant where there are no conditions attached for the uses of funds. We've received requests for items that were not approved in your grant agreement, and unfortunately, we can't approve those. This is a grant that is for specific goals only, and the items that were approved in your grant agreement are the only items that we can approve you for reimbursement. So what happens then? Once you submit your invoice request along with your supporting documentation showing proof, then we will review your invoices and send you an email that your invoice has been approved. Supporting documentation can be all kinds of things, paid receipts, paid contract from your contractor, a bank statement or a credit card. It must be itemized so we can see what you guys purchased. But so just want to make clear, this is a reimbursement grant program. Next slide. So the invoice timeline, grantees can submit an invoice reimbursement request once per month. So as you incur expenses throughout the month, you can't submit weekly requests. You can only do it once per month, and preferably at the end of the month. So if you're submitting additional submissions, we cannot accept those. Grantees may enter expenses in the Grants Connect throughout the month and upload your some supporting documentation before finalizing and submitting your completed invoice. And this might be helpful if you're doing this, daily or weekly, updating Grants Connect. Therefore, it'll save you time at the end of the month. I know sometimes if I'm trying to beat a deadline and I save everything at the end, I'm scrambling to meet that deadline. So when you're in Grants Connect, it auto saves, so you can go in and just enter your expenses as they occur, and Grants Connect will auto save that for you. And you want to make sure you're submitting that by the last day of the month to be considered in the following month's payment cycle, because if you miss that, then you'll roll to the following month. If there are no expenses incurred, then you do not need to submit an invoice. You'll submit an invoice as you incur expenses. Next slide. So required forms. Before we can reimburse you, we have to have these forms on file. Your banking form, that's a must because we will need to know where to send your payment to. And then the authorized representative banking validation form validates who is authorized to submit invoices for your organization, and your insurance form. So many of you, we have all these forms on file, but if any of these forms have expired, especially the insurance form, we will be reaching out to you. So if you notice that your insurance has expired, it's helpful that you go ahead and you submit that to us. We cannot reimburse you for invoices unless you complete the invoice reimbursement request form, and that is completed in Grants Connect. And you must have supporting documentation showing proof of purchases along with that invoice reimbursement request form. The quarterly progress report is a required form, and you must submit that quarterly. Even if you have not began work, you would submit that and just state that in your quarterly progress report. As you complete your work, you will describe in your quarterly progress report what you've done for your project. And if you're having any hardships or if you've had to purchase anything different, and we'll go over that later, you're going to explain everything or any changes in your quarterly progress report. Next slide. So how do I get reimbursed for expenses? So we're going to give you some examples. We're going to talk about, documents, supporting documents that will help you, and those will be later on in this presentation. So when you're submitting your invoice reimbursement form, grantees should ensure that all items and expenses requested in that invoice align with your grant agreement and your budget. So you really want to make sure that what you're asking for is an approved item, because expenses that are claimed in that reimbursement, we cannot approve. And we're receiving a lot of requests where the item wasn't approved, and it's slowing down our review. Review all expenses claimed to ensure that there are no duplicate expenses. So just make sure you didn't claim that expense in the previous month. Check for calculation errors. We're receiving a lot of calculation errors, and again, we'll go over that in future slides. And reimbursement requests that exceed the total awarded amount cannot be paid. Grantees will be responsible to pay any costs and/or expenses that exceed their awarded amount. So we have had some requests where grantees have asked if they could increase their award amount due to increasing costs, and we understand prices, they go up. It almost seems daily now, but we cannot increase your award amount. The award amounts are final, but what we can do is do a budget shift from one category to another. If you're experiencing a shortage and you want to take funds from one category and put that to another, but it has to be an approved item, and there's very specific rules around that, and we can go over that. We'll be going over that towards the end of the presentation. Next slide. So missing documentation or calculation errors. So what if I did not provide the correct supporting documentation, or my invoice has calculation errors? Can I still get reimbursed? So the answer is yes, but you will need to correct those errors before we can reimburse you. So we cannot deduct the items out that are incorrect. We will contact you and say, okay, you have items here that weren't approved. You need to update your invoice and resubmit. So if you're receiving an automatic email from Grants Connect, you'll get something that says request for correction, or we need further documentation. If you receive any automatic email from Grants Connect, please review it right away and get in your Grants Connect account so you can see what errors are needed. And or if PCG emails you, or you receive an email from the Bridge to Recovery inbox or a phone call, we'd like you to get those corrected as soon as possible and resubmitted so we can pay you in a timely manner. We know invoices are backed up a little bit, and we're trying to get to everybody so that we can go over with you what is needed to be corrected for your invoice so it can be resubmitted and we can get you guys paid. Next slide. So what is the exact required documentation in order to get paid? So it's not an exact science. There are many different documents that you can provide, and we're going to give you some examples, but the calculations must be accurate. So we have many people today presenting from Public Consulting Group, and we have Sheena Hoyer Ward and Vicki Jackson. So I'll go ahead and turn the presentation over to PCG.
Okay, everyone. We're moving on to the next portion of the webinar, which covers the types of documentation required to support reimbursement requests. Slide 13, which is the slide that we're now on, discusses the types of documentation that are acceptable for salaries and wages. For salaries and wages, the most accepted form of documentation is a software-generated payroll report, as well as check stubs and general ledger reports. It's important to remember that an Excel spreadsheet by itself is not an acceptable proof of payment. However, one can be submitted along with a payroll report. In addition, I didn't turn my camera on, sorry. In addition, grantees may only be reimbursed for, something's wrong with my camera here. I'm just going to go ahead and turn that back off. In addition, grantees may only be reimbursed for hours worked, so be mindful when submitting the reimbursement request to deduct all other expenses, as personal time off is not an eligible expense. Likewise, grantees will only be reimbursed the wage that is awarded in the grant agreement, even if a higher wage was paid. Next slide. For requests for wage differentials and temporary employees, the request must include the time frame the employee is being paid, hours worked, and staff names and job titles as reflected in the grant agreement. Please avoid listing TBD or to be determined in the request, which is something that we often see. Include only the staff names and job titles listed in the grant agreement. When requesting a wage differential, be sure to provide the difference between the old wage and the new wage, as well as payroll reports that support the wage increase. Next slide. Bonuses may be paid in full or incrementally at a maximum of $1,000 per employee for round one. Software-generated payroll documents are accepted as appropriate documentation because it generally provides all the data that is needed to include the time period, the pay rate, hours worked, and taxes and benefits withheld. You may redact the names of employees listed on the payroll report for which no reimbursement is being claimed. However, if the names are not redacted, it must be clear to which employees the reimbursement applies. Next slide. This is an example of software-generated payroll report with all of the data points required to support a reimbursement request. Outlined in red is the regular pay and hours that would be awarded, as well as the PTO hours and pay that may not be included in the invoice request. Next slide. This example reflects the data points expected to support a wage differential request. It's a spreadsheet here that we indicated earlier could be provided to support your payroll documentation. However, as you can see here, it has the old wage, the new wage, the increase that's being requested, as well as the hours worked, and then the total amount so that we know what exactly is being requested. One important thing here is also the dates of service here. That's also important to know and have in your documentation. Next slide. Here is an example of a pay stub with all of the required data points to support a reimbursement request. As with the slide earlier, outlined in red is the regular pay and the number of hours that would be awarded, as well as the PTO hours and pay that may not be included in the invoice request. Next slide. Here's another example. This one is supporting documentation received to support a request for wage differential. Highlighted in red on these documents is the difference in pay increasing from $21, as noted in the top document, to $23, as noted in the bottom document, per hour, as well as the number of hours worked, indicated, not highlighted, but indicated on both documents. This proves the employee was paid an additional $120. However, the dates of pay is what is missing on this example and is a good example of how the verification process would be delayed. Next slide. To reiterate, an acceptable form of documentation must include the old wage, new wage, the number of hours worked, and the time frame of the hours worked, which includes the dates as well as how often an employee is paid. Again, an Excel document by itself is not an acceptable documentation, as one can be easily altered, making it much less reliable, whereas payroll software includes features that ensure compliance with federal, state, and local labor laws and tax regulations. For wage differential, it's important to provide the old and new pay stub for an employee, verifying the difference in rates, as well as the other previously discussed data points necessary to verify payment. Next slide. If an employee included in the grant agreement happens to leave an organization, the funds may be transferred to an existing or new employee as a temporary worker, so long as 1, the job title is permissible, 2, a change request form is submitted, and 3, the grantee is willing to absorb the difference in pay if the employee is hired at a higher rate than that awarded in the grant agreement. Next slide. Another change that happens within a grantee's organization is when an employee is promoted or moves to a different position with a different title than what is listed in the grant agreement. If this happens, the grantee may still use the funds for the staff member, but only if the employee moves to a permissible staff title, or the grantee may use the funds for a different employee so long as they are working in a permissible staff title. This requires the grantees to submit a change request form that includes the change needed, the new employee's name, the new employee's staff title, and the date the employee was hired. Next slide. It's important to remember that acceptable proof of payment must be submitted for bonuses as well, which includes the time frame and amount paid, whether the bonus was paid incrementally or in full. Funds awarded for retention and recruitment bonuses may also be transferred to new or existing employees holding a permissible staff title with the submission of a change request form. Next slide. Fringe benefits include the other payments made by an employer in addition to an employee's regular salary, such as health insurance, retirement, PTO, and other things. For fringe, it's important to remember that it can only be claimed for employees included in the grant agreement. It cannot be claimed if only a bonus was approved. For the fringe, the percentage must be stated in the request and calculated correctly, and that percentage must be reflected on the grant agreement. It must be supported with documentation and proof of payment. It must also specify the duration and time frame a fringe benefit is being paid to an employee, for example, weekly, biweekly, and etc. And it must state each staff name and job title for each employee. I'm going to turn it over to Vicki Jackson now, who's going to continue talking about acceptable forms of documentation.
Good morning, everyone. So for documentation for supplies and equipment, in order to receive reimbursement for supplies and equipment, you must submit supporting documentation that proves the purchase or payment for those items. Acceptable examples include paid invoices, receipts, and if you're using bank statements and credit card statements as supporting documentation, keep in mind that these statements must show the itemized purchases. Any of the provided documentation and receipts must clearly itemize the items purchased. Any ineligible items on a receipt or invoice will not be reimbursed. Next slide. Changes in quantity or price. Can grantees purchase more or less units if prices have increased or decreased since grant execution? The answer is yes. However, if there are price changes as a grantee, you can buy more or fewer units of the same or similar item. As with all purchases, receipts and proof of purchase is required. And when these situations occur, it is very helpful to us if an explanation is provided along with the receipt. As an explanation, such as since the grant was awarded, these items have increased in price, therefore we purchased less. Or since the grant was awarded, the unit amount has decreased, therefore we purchased more. These types of examples can be, and explanations can be very helpful. And we'll go over a couple of those examples on the next slide. But lastly, any changes along with the reasons are to be outlined in the quarterly progress report. Next slide. So the examples for changes in quantity or price. Budget approves purchase of 20 items at $49, which equals $980. Prices for the same item have increased to $59. Grantee purchases 17 items at $59 for a total cost of $1,003. Grantee pays the difference from $1,003 to $980 of $23. So in this example, due to the price increase, the grantee is responsible for the $23. For the next example, the grantee purchases 16 items at $59, totaling $944, which leaves $36. The grantee can request the $36 to be shifted to another approved budget category. This way, the grantee remains under budget and has the ability to move the $36 remaining to another budget category. Next slide. Documentation for contractual expenses. So the required documentation for reimbursement of contractual expenses are 2 itemized bids and a paid invoice. So the 2 itemized bids should include an explanation for the selected bid. An example of this explanation can be contractor A was selected because they could begin work right away instead of contractor B, who could not begin work for 6 months. The paid invoice is defined as proof of payment for completed work or services obtained through an approved contract, as approved in the budget. If the project is not yet finished, the invoice should detail the remaining work and associated costs. Grantees must cover expenses out of pocket before seeking reimbursement. Reimbursement for items listed on the paid invoice must match those approved in the budget outlined in the grant agreement. Next slide. Cost increase for contractual work. What if I obtained an updated bid and the new bid is higher due to increased costs since submission of my original bid that was approved in my executed grant agreement? What can I do? Well, the grantee can request a budget shift, which involves transferring funds from one approved budget category to another additional to cover the additional costs. To do this, you must submit a change request form at least 30 days before the desired changes. All budget shifts must receive prior approval from CDA. For example, if a grantee is approved to install an HVAC system and receives a new bid that increases the cost by $5,000, they may request to shift the $5,000 from their approved flooring project to cover the increase in the HVAC project. Next slide. Proof of payment for those contractual expenses. So supporting documentation needed for proof of payment includes, but is not limited to, paid invoices, which should indicate that they are paid, detailed work completed, and show any remaining balance if applicable. Itemized receipts, subcontractor billing statements, and/or payments reflecting the amount paid and any remaining balance if applicable. Itemized bank statements are credit card statements that show purchases. By now, you've heard the word itemized quite often. Basically, the more detailed the supporting documentation is, the more clear and concise the reimbursement request will be for an easier approval. Copies of canceled checks, which must match the invoice. Once again, the work completed and any other items purchased before a reimbursement can be submitted and approved. Next slide. So here we're going to go over an example of a paid invoice. This invoice includes an invoice number, as you can see, the beginning and end dates of the work that was completed, the quantity, rates, and totals are all very detailed and should clearly tie back to the grant agreement. Another required and key component of this invoice is that it shows as paid, which is I see it's on the next slide. So at the bottom, you can see highlighted in red where the invoice was actually paid. One of the other identifiers on this invoice that can be tied back to a canceled check, which was discussed in the previous slide as one of the required proofs of documentation, is that the actual invoice amount, the invoice number, and of course the amount should coincide with the scope of the work completed. Next slide. Documentation for travel expenses. Expenses for travel cannot exceed the approved California state rates available on the CalHR website. Any costs that exceed the CalHR approved rates will not be reimbursed, and the grantee will need to cover the difference. So you may refer to the CalHR website for any guidance and details on any travel-related reimbursement requests. You will have to pay out of pocket and then request reimbursement after the travel. Supporting documentation needed for proof of payment includes, but is not limited to, airfare receipts, hotel receipts, itemized bank statements or credit card statements, mileage driven with a Google printout showing the route to and from, and receipts must also include the date and purpose of travel. Next slide. Reminders for receipts. All receipts must include a date to confirm when the expense actually was incurred. The date must fall within the grant period of November 20th, 2023 through March 31st of 2026. Any ineligible expenses listed on the receipts or paid invoices should not be included in the reimbursement request and must be deducted by the grantee. So, for example, if the budget approves the purchase of 100 hand sanitizer soaps for $300 and 20 boxes of medical gloves for $340, totaling $640, but the receipt submitted totals $790 and includes pet supplies for $150. The grantee should submit the receipt as supporting documentation, but only request reimbursement for $640, not the full $790. Receipts must be itemized to clearly show all purchased items, and those items must be included in the budget approved in the grant agreement. Next slide, please. Indirect costs. Indirect costs should be calculated based on the allowable expenses being invoiced. No supporting documentation is required for indirect costs, and indirect reimbursement requests for indirect costs. Invoice reimbursement requests, for indirect costs must be submitted regularly, such as monthly or at least quarterly, as expenses are incurred throughout the grant period. Indirect costs cannot be paid to grantees in a lump sum. You cannot request a budget shift to transfer funds into indirect costs to increase the awarded amount for that category. So I know that earlier we provided a couple of examples where budget shifts are allowed, but keep in mind that a request to shift budget into indirect costs is not allowed. However, you may request a budget shift to move funds out of indirect costs to another approved budget category. So no budget transfers into indirect costs, only out of the indirect cost budget line. And lastly, of course, a change request form must be submitted and approved before any funds can be shifted. And I'll turn it over to common errors with Roxanne.
Thank you, Vicki. Okay, we're going to cover just some of the common errors that we have seen to try to help you guys submit a cleaner invoice and get your invoice approved more timely. Next slide. So missing wage differential support that supports the old wage and the new wage and proof of payment issued to the employee. So many times we're receiving the pay stub that shows the new wage, but not the old wage. So we need to have proof for the old wage and the new wage, and that can be in a payroll report or the old pay stub and the new pay stub. And you only have to submit that once. You don't have to keep submitting the old pay stub, not unless you're giving them a wage differential in increments. So but if you're just giving it one time, you just submit the old wage the first time, and you don't have to keep submitting that. Also, we've received a lot of requests submitting the invoice with a TBD instead of an employee's name. We cannot make payment to TBD. So the employee has to be hired, and we have to have the name of the employee and the title, the staff title of the employee. Requesting reimbursement costs not incurred and our work that has not been performed and paid, we cannot pay that out. We're receiving a lot of requests prior to. So you must pay for the work, pay the employee, pay for whatever it is you were approved for, and then submit your request for reimbursement along with the supporting documentation. Next slide. We've also received invoices for prepaid items. So unfortunately, we cannot reimburse for a deposit because a deposit, there was no work performed for a deposit. A lot of contractors require a deposit just to hold the date. We've received requests for yearly subscriptions, and we can't pay for those either because those have not happened yet. So as you're paying your monthly subscription, then we can reimburse you for those costs. We're receiving invoices, but the bid isn't provided or the cost estimate for the contractual work. And we must have those in order to pay the invoice along with the paid invoice so we can see the work that was done. The state requires 2 bids because this is a competitive grant. And then you would just simply explain, as we mentioned earlier, why you picked the bid you did. And you may have even have picked the higher bid, and that's acceptable. You just need to explain why. In the example that we provided earlier, contractor A was selected because they could do the work faster than contractor B. And even if the contractor A is higher, that's totally acceptable. Receipts and invoices not itemized showing the work that was completed. So we're receiving receipts that don't specify what was purchased. And this is a specific grant, and we can only reimburse you for items that were approved in your grant agreement. So just make sure the invoices that you're submitting show what was purchased. And if there's anything on your invoice that was not allowable, as the slide we showed earlier, where you can get on Amazon and purchase, maybe you were approved for masks and hand sanitizer, but you also purchase some dog supplies for yourself. That's totally acceptable. You can't separate items out of your receipt, but just make sure those items aren't requested in your invoice total. Next slide. So miscalculations and missing information. So we're seeing a lot where the wage differential totals are not correct. The salaries for the invoice for the pay period, we're seeing where you were approved for, maybe a wage differential for, $20 to $22, but the invoice that was submitted, you're paying the grantee $24 because you couldn't hire that employee. You had to hire them in at a higher amount. And that's fine, but we can't pay for that higher amount. That's going to have to be on the grantee. We can only pay for what you were approved for. As mentioned earlier, total hours worked are missing. So you need to make sure you're including the total hours worked, and that should be in your pay stub or in your payroll report. And make sure there are no calculation errors. And we're seeing calculation errors with the fringe. You need to make sure that percentage is stated and it's based on the correct salary that was approved in your grant agreement. And indirect costs, as Vicki mentioned, we can't pay all of those upfront. Indirect costs happen usually on a monthly or quarterly basis, and we can only reimburse those as the indirect costs occur. Again, missing documentation to show proof of purchase. We're getting invoice requests with no supporting documentation or very limited supporting documentation. Not deducting impermissible expenses from the supporting documentation, such as PTO. The grant pays for hours worked only and straight time. So it doesn't pay for overtime or any PTO. So you need to deduct those out of your total invoice. And it would be helpful too if you're mentioning that, every comment that you make is helpful for us. My receipt shows these items purchased. I know they're not approved in the grant and I'm not claiming those. The pay stub shows PTO. I have deducted that out. The more direction you give us, the faster we can get your invoice approved. Again, receipts having impermissible items not approved in the grant agreement. Next slide. Now I'm going to turn it over to Chantel Bush, and she's going to talk about change requests and budget shifts.
Thank you, Roxanne. I know this is a very desirable topic, so I'm going to go over what I can provide in detail here. We did cover some examples in some of the former slides. So the change request form and budget shift request process. Question is, when should you submit a change request form? Any activities or changes to your budget, including any budget shifts from one approved category that is specified in your executed grant agreement, that will result in a change in activities, a change in objectives and or the deliverables, will require the submission of a change request form. We provided some other examples, for instance, that may require a change request form. Just for tracking purposes, there's some grant agreements that have TBD. It allows us to connect some of your staff names now that you have hired and replace those names with TBD in order for us to maintain tracking of the invoice reimbursement process. All changes or any shifts to the budgets or any of the objectives that were previously mentioned do require written approval from CBA. In order to get access to the change request form, grantees must send an email to PCG or they can call and request the change request form. Following that contact, PCG will then email a link that will allow the grantees to complete and submit the change request form. We recognize that costs have gone up, but we do require that grantees should submit a change request form within 30 days of advance of making the change, if that is indeed possible. Grantees will then have their change request form reviewed, and it will be reviewed against the executed grant agreement. And if we determine that there is an approval or denial, once we make a decision on that, we will go ahead and follow that request up in an email. I do just want to remind you that as we do review the change request forms, in some aspects, it may result in an amendment to the grant agreement, but we will review those and we will be in contact with the grantee on what of any of the conditions that would result in their change request that would require a potential amendment. Just as a reminder, all change request forms must be submitted and approved before any funds can be shifted. I will then go ahead now and turn it over to Peter to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Chantel. So just go to the next slide for our sort of general Q&A guidelines. So we've seen a lot of people posting questions in the chat and the Q&A. Thank you for posting them there. I believe at this point, people, our members from PCG who have been going through the chat have hit most, if not all of them. So if you did post a question in the chat or the Q&A, please check there to see if it has been answered. For now, I'll just go through. Give me a second and I'll review, see if we have any that haven't been answered there. No, like I said, it looks like we've hit all of them thus far. Please, everybody, continue. If you have more questions, post them in that Q&A or the chat. We have plenty of time now to go through them. But like I said, if you have posted one already, please do check to see if you have an answer there.
Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat.
One more in the chat just now, Roxanne, as you started speaking. Basically, the question is, okay, a couple more actually now. I think some of these things we covered in the presentation, but it's always nice to sort of get a refresher. So first off, Shirley Lewis is asking if there is sort of a way to escalate requests beyond sort of just reaching out through the existing grant communications line.
You may email bridge2recovery@ca.gov. You can,
And
you
then,
can.
yeah,
Oh,
please, Roxanne. No, I was going to
you-
move on to the next question. So if you have
Okay, go
additional
ahead.
advice.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
If you email the PCG email, and then you can copy that email address that I just gave you, and we'll take a look at it.
And then another question just on general timelines. So what's the timeline for invoice review and reimbursement?
So I think I saw Brittany post that earlier. So typically, grantees should be receiving payment. We're issuing payment on the 45th day. If the invoice, if there's no questions that we have, we're seeing a lot of invoice that we just can't process because we don't have the supporting documentation or there's calculation errors. But if you have a perfect invoice, you should be receiving your payment within that time frame.
Thank you, Roxanne. And Oleg, I just posted that same answer Brittany gave earlier in response to your question. You know, if you just want to read through it again, it's right there.
Sure.
And then we got another one, question in the Q&A from Kevin Phipps asking if there's a way they can check on the status of their well, let me just read the whole question. Kevin Phipps requested an amendment to the grant agreement on 8/21. Any way they can check on the status of the review for it. So basically a way to check on the status of change requests.
Please send an email to those emails address that we provided, and we can check on that for you. And just make sure you're including your grant agreement number. That's the easiest way for us to look up your account.
Brittany, Ted, this additional question might be for one of you. It's sort of twofold. First one is just how many PCG staff members review reimbursement requests? And then I sort of think that question is to get to the second one. How long is that final administrative review for change requests, or excuse me, reimbursement requests?
I think it's going to be hard to answer how many reviewers we have, because there are quite a few at different levels. If something comes in and it needs to be escalated, then it gets escalated to the next reviewer. So I don't think that's a good question we can answer. Like there's 2 or there's 5 or that's very difficult because we have several reviewers from PCG and CDA.
I think, Roxanne, then it'd be fair to say that the answer is going to be similar for that second half. How long is the final administrative review? Again, that timeline will probably vary, but it should fall within those parameters we outlined as part of our answers to previous questions related to the timeline.
Yes.
Yeah, it's also worth mentioning as well that, I mean, there are multiple, Roxanne alluded to that, but there are multiple levels of review. So we do have at least 2 reviewers looking at each submission, and then there's a number of administrative review levels. So each of those levels does require a little bit of time to go through. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more information on that process.
Genevieve, to answer your question about the slides, these slides will be posted on the Bridge to Recovery website. They haven't yet, but we'll make sure we get those up as soon as we can. And then a question from Shirley Lewis is about how to request the change request form. PCG, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we said on one of the previous slides that if you need a change request form, to go ahead and email that to us, and we'll make sure. Yep, here we go. Thank you, Chantel. I appreciate that. Please do just email that CDA_bridge to recovery or call that phone number, and we'll make sure you get a copy of the change request form. And then we had another one, I think. Oh, a couple more in the Q&A. So one from Rima. Can grantees check the status of their invoice? So I think we did talk about change request forms, but status is for reimbursement requests. Is there a way?
They can email I actually was just responding as you were reading that, Peter. But you can email the CDA bridge to recovery at pcgus.com to check the status. I would also say, if you just submitted an invoice or reimbursement request today, it's going to be a couple of days at minimum before that potentially gets reviewed. So, if you're looking at something from previous months, please absolutely email us if you haven't heard any response at all, especially.
Yeah. And, we have over 300 approved applicants. So if you're submitting an invoice today, it's not going to be reviewed same day. I mean, chances are, it's going to take 5 to 7 days for the first reviewer to get to that. So just know that you're not alone in submitting your invoice, and we're trying to get to it within that 5 and 7 day turnaround time, and then contact you if there's any questions or issues. And Grants Connect sends an auto email, and we've heard reports that sometimes you guys aren't getting those. So please make sure you're checking your spam. And if you receive one of those, get in your Grants Connect and read what the message posted there is, so you can edit it or fix whatever we're asking you to do.
And I think, Roxanne, this is just a good time to underscore or reiterate a lot of what this webinar was about, the importance of submitting accurate supporting documentation for your requests. That really has been one of the largest delays in us being able to process your reimbursement requests and get you your funds that I know that you all need, and you've been working so hard for this grant program. But that correct supporting documentation is critical and delays our ability to get that processed for you. So I think just want to reiterate what this was about today to support you all with that.
And I'll just piggyback on that. If you're having any concerns or questions, like you don't know what to submit, please reach out to us.
Yes.
and we can help you.
And I also just want to reiterate, we went over some really detailed information in the slides, some really good examples. We will also have this posted on our Bridge to Recovery Grant webpage for reference back to, that hopefully that will assist in getting some of your submitted documentation accurate enough to ensure that there will not any delays in your reimbursement review process request. And I'll make sure to post that also in the chat as well.
Thank you, everyone, for your detailed answers. Couple more questions. CDA, this one's for you. I don't know how simple it'll be to sort of give a succinct answer, but Altamedix ADHD was asking why overtime hours as a payroll expense are not eligible. I see. Yeah, so Ted provided an answer. I'll just read it out and then you can give some additional context if necessary. Ted answered that overtime could be eligible if they are noted in your grant agreement. Otherwise, they would not be permissible, which seems like a fair enough answer to me.
That's correct. You would have had to requested that up front. Otherwise, the grant just pays for straight time.
Thank you. And thank you, PCG, for being so quick. I barely get to the questions before you have them answered.
I saw a question about, can we talk about the vehicle purchase? And unfortunately, that's round 2, and we're not going to discuss the eligible items for this. This is specifically for invoicing, how to get grantees paid, and to answer any questions grantees have about their reimbursement request. You can email us if you have any questions about the vehicle purchase, though.
And then one question in the chat after that one you just answered, Roxanne, is just if somebody can submit multiple changes on a single change request form, or if they need to submit multiple forms for each request.
One request is fine, yes.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. This one is in the Q&A. Santa Mendoza is asking if they missed indirect costs on the last invoice, can they include it in the next invoice?
Yes.
Perfect. Then I think that takes us, we got about 1 minute left, so I will toss it back to CDA in just a second, but I will reiterate that these slides and the recording will be posted to the CDA Bridge to Recovery website. So if you want to review it, find it there. And if any questions come up, you didn't quite think of today or that we didn't get to, please do shoot us an email at that email address we've posted in the chat throughout, and we'll make sure you get answers as soon as possible. Again, it's just CDA_bridge to recovery at pcgus.com. And with that, I will then turn it back to CDA for our conclusion.
Great. Thank
Please,
you everyone for joining us today. I will give Roxanne last words, but I do want to also just send a reminder out that, as Peter said, this one's going to be posted on our website along with the PowerPoint and the recording. We do have another session scheduled for next week on September 26th at 12:30. So if some of your colleagues or other folks who handle some of your invoicing processes were not able to attend today, we do highly encourage that they register for that webinar as well as refer in the interim to our website for this particular webinar.
Thank you, Chantel. Please visit our website for further resources. The official RFA and addendums are there. Recorded webinars. This webinar will be recorded posted there along with the PowerPoint, a permissible resource document, and eligible staff titles. Again, on behalf of CDA, we'd like to thank you for attending today. And just know we realize invoicing is not easy. And this invoice was not intended to point out, things that you guys aren't that you guys are doing wrong. I hope you guys didn't take it that way. It's to assist you on what to submit, the errors that we're seeing, and how to get your invoice processed more timely. So if you think of any questions later, please feel free to email us or join us on the webinar next week, as Chantel mentioned. And again, we thank you for joining us today.